In the autumn of 1349, a farm laborer in rural England was earning a wage no one alive had ever seen before. 2 years earlier, he had no leverage at all. He worked the land, owed labor to his lord, and took whatever was offered. Now, landowners were begging him to stay, offering him double, sometimes triple, his old pay. Nothing about the land had changed, nothing about the crops had changed. What had changed was the number of people left to work it. By the time the plague finished tearing through Europe in 1351, somewhere between a third and half of the population was dead. Entire villages stood empty. Church bells stopped ringing because there was no one left to ring them. The math of survival had flipped overnight. There was suddenly more land, more food, more property, and far fewer hands to manage any of it. For the people who lived through it, that arithmetic should have meant disaster. Instead, for many of them, it meant the opposite. Before the plague, Europe had too many people and not enough land. Peasants were easy to replace, so lords had no reason to treat them well. After the plague, that equation reversed completely. Fields sat unharvested, livestock wandered untended. Landowners who once dictated terms now needed labor badly enough to compete for it. In one English record from this period, a lord paying laborers 1 penny a day in 1348 was paying double that just 2 years later. Other landowners nearby were offering triple. Peasants noticed. Some who were legally bound to a single manor simply walked away, knowing a desperate landlord a few villages over would hire them without asking questions. Skilled workers, carpenters, masons, left their villages for towns where wages climbed even faster. For the first time in living memory, an ordinary laborer could refuse work, negotiate pay, or leave entirely. The system of feudal obligation that had defined European life for centuries was being quietly ignored, one runaway worker at a time. The nobility saw this happening and panicked. Their wealth had always depended on cheap, captive labor. If peasants could now name their price, the entire foundation of aristocratic power was at risk. So in 1351, the English Parliament, controlled by the landowning class, passed the Statute of Labourers. The law made it illegal to pay any worker more than the wages in effect back in 1346, before the plague. It also made it illegal for laborers to simply leave their village in search of better pay elsewhere. It was, in essence, an attempt to legislate the laws of supply and demand out of existence. It did not work. Lords desperate enough to lose their entire workforce broke the law constantly, quietly paying the higher wages anyway, rather than watch their fields go fallow. Court records from the decades after the statute are full of laborers fined for leaving one master to chase better pay at another's farm, only to do it again a few years later. The labor shortage was simply too severe, and the leverage it created too real for a piece of paper to undo. What the Statute of Labourers did accomplish was something else entirely. It planted resentment that would not stay buried. For 30 years, peasants watched their wages get capped by law, while landlords still profited from rising prices. By 1381, that resentment exploded into open revolt. Tens of thousands of English peasants, led by a man named Wat Tyler, marched on London demanding an end to serfdom altogether. They burned manor records, executed officials they blamed for the wage laws, and forced their way into direct negotiation with the teenage king. The revolt was crushed within weeks, but the message had been delivered, and lords across England understood it. In the decades that followed, serfdom in much of Western Europe simply began to dissolve, not through a single law or royal decree, but through thousands of individual landlords realizing that converting unfree peasants into paid tenants, or selling freedom outright in exchange for cash rents, was now the only system that could actually hold a workforce together. Land was abundant, labor was scarce, and for the first time, that scarcity belonged to the people doing the work. The plague reached further than wages and land, though. It reached the church itself. For centuries, the Catholic Church had positioned itself as Europe's protector against suffering, sin, and death, the one institution capable of explaining catastrophe and offering a path through it. The Black Death tested that claim directly, and in the eyes of many survivors, the Church failed it. Priests fled their parishes. Some demanded huge sums to perform last rites for the dying. Entire religious orders saw the same death rates as everyone else, which raised an uncomfortable question Europeans had never had to ask out loud before. If God's chosen intermediaries weren't protected either, what exactly were they protecting anyone from? Into that vacuum stepped movements the church had never sanctioned. Bands of flagellants marched between towns, publicly whipping themselves in the streets, convinced that physical suffering could appease a god who had apparently turned his back on Christendom. Crowds gathered to watch, drawn by a desperation the official church no longer seemed able to address. The papacy eventually banned the movement as a threat to its authority, but the fact that thousands had turned to self-inflicted penance instead of their own priests said something the ban couldn't undo. None of this means the plague was, in any sense, a hidden blessing. It does not minimize what 14th century Europeans actually lived through, watching neighbors, children, and entire households die within days, often with no understanding of why. The historians who study this period are careful to separate two different truths that can both be accurate at once. The plague was an almost incomprehensible catastrophe, and for the people who survived it, the world that came afterward offered opportunities their parents never had. That is the strange inheritance of the Black Death. It did not improve anyone's life by design. It improved lives by accident, through the cold mechanics of scarcity, by removing so many hands from the workforce that the hands remaining became valuable in a way they had never been before. The laborer earning double his old wage in 1349 didn't win anything. He simply outlived a catastrophe large enough to break a social order that had stood, unquestioned, for centuries, and stepped into whatever came next.